So I think when most people hear the term, sex ed, or I need to tell my kids about sex, you guys, I think as adults, we think of the in and out. We think of the behaviors that we do as adults.
Right.
If you think of it in terms of sexuality,
right.
which sex is only a small part
right.
of a bigger picture. Mm-hmm. And it makes these conversations less threatening, because then it makes it into this whole other range of conversations that we can have. So it could be about body image, it could be about self-esteem with little kids, it could be just about friendship and different kinds of families, mm-hmm. and marriage and commitments and divorce and all of that, going up to decision making and negotiating and sexual health and contraception and abstinence. And
right.
I mean, it's a span of things, from just things that we deal with in everyday life. Well, this is all stuff we deal with in everyday life, but just about sort of who we are as individuals, and then including in that behaviors. But behaviors is really a small part. So when we're trying to protect the innocence mm-hmm. of our children, what are we trying to protect them against? I think most of the time it's the sexual concerns,
right.
and it's the unintended pregnancy, and it's the sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections, however people want to refer to that.
Okay.
Basically, they're the same thing, just two different words, because those things are often infections rather than diseases.
Okay.
But they're the same.
Okay.
Right. And so what are we protecting them against? And then we're up against all this misinformation and these media messages that might not be our family values, mm-hmm. and might not be truly the facts. And so you have to decide, well, what's more important? Is it protecting the innocence of our children at the expense of having them not be educated? Mm-hmm. In the sense that...
Well, let me interject something
Sure.
here, because some of the things that you talked about, like contraception and sexually transmitted diseases and so forth, I don't think my 8-year-old necessarily needs to know about that. So that's maybe the conversation for an older child, while you're saying you're kind of laying the groundwork for talking about things that are relevant to that particular age.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely topics that are easily appropriate for certain ages. Mm-hmm. So yeah, with younger kids, you don't need to go into the specifics, but there definitely are kids that are exposed to information, and you don't want to not talk about it if these are things that they're curious about.
Oh, that's true too. Right.
So
they may have heard something like, what are condoms? I'm sure, like by 3rd or 4th grade, kids have heard that word before. There's 2 things I want to talk about based on what you said.
Sure.
Now, one of them is that one friend of mine said, I don't want my daughter knowing about sex, because then she's going to think, or she's going to ask me every time mommy and daddy close the door to our room, she's going to come up with an uncomfortable question of, is that what you're doing in there? So how do you deal with something like that? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, it's never really an easy topic, although it should be, because that's how they got there in the first place.
Right.
But there's definitely boundaries, I think, is a really big part of it. I mean, I think it's important that kids at some point know how a baby is made, and oftentimes that happens when they're very young. Even just the sharing of a book, they can show that a part of the mommy, and it's not always part of the daddy anymore. Maybe it was a donor, whatever it might be.
Good point.
But so the ova,
you were made in a petri dish.
And sometimes
is really
even
true,
right, and
or adoption, obviously,
right,
that has got to
there's
come
so
up.
many different and that's too, when I was talking earlier about different kinds of families. I mean, that's sort of where those conversations come in as well.
Right.
So I think it's important for young people, and it's totally cool for them to know from the very beginning the basics.
Right.
And usually that's all they want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're faced with the question, if your child thinks that when you and your partner close the door, that you're in there having sex, you might even ask, well, what do you think sex is? And what they think and what you're thinking might be 2 separate things.
Yeah, that's true.
So that could be sort of just a good indication of, well, how much do I need?
Right.
I think, though, a common scenario is being walked in on.
Yeah,
that happens quite
Yeah.
often, and people often, parents always ask, well, what do I do then? And how do I explain that?
That is a tricky one.
So you want to go there?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So if that happens, usually the door is probably unlocked, right? They're walking in, typically the bedroom, and they see you doing something in bed. So I'm just going to sort of tell you how to navigate that. So what you can do is say, honey, mommy and daddy will be right with you, or mommy will be right with you, or whatever the situation might be, why don't you go wait in the hallway or go to your room for a moment or two, and I'll be right out. Then what you can do is sort of, put a robe on, whatever, go out and just kind of explain what happened. Now, you don't need to be explaining the details of what you were doing, but the child might be thinking, oh, is so-and-so hurting so-and-so?
Right. That's typically the response you hear.
Yeah, and so you can just say, well, actually, when two people, and then you can share your values. I mean, it's really important just to think about what these messages are and the values are before this happens, so that you're able to share them.
Right.
And just say, well, let's just say it's a mother and a father. Well, mommy and daddy are in, when people are in love, this is one way that they express love, and they get close together, and and you can say they play or whatever they make each other feel good,
how old the child is,
or we just lay really close, however it's comfortable to explain it. Usually that's enough, depending on the child's age. They may or may not have more questions, and you can navigate that as it goes. I think that what parents don't realize is about setting boundaries, and I don't think it's appropriate to share your behaviors of what you're doing with your partner with your child.
Give me like a more concrete example of that. Sharing your behaviors, like being like too
detailed.
Explicit
I think too explicit. I mean, maybe you can decide whether or not you want to do that with your teenagers. There are things in any of these topics of sexuality. Even if it's something about puberty, for example, it's one thing to say, well, we all went through puberty. I went through puberty. This was my experience going through puberty. That's a little different than describing sort of intimate sexual acts and the how-tos. Sex ed does not need to be about a how-to.
Yes, of course.
With certain behaviors. So sort of tailoring that, but oftentimes back to the child who walked in the bedroom, it's really just sort of just taking care of that situation, letting the child, giving the information that they need in that moment, and then figuring out for next time how you're going to handle that situation. Maybe you have a system where you lock the door and they have to knock on the door.
Okay.
And then as a parent or as the adult in the house, or whoever, whatever the relationship might be, those are things that we have to do as adults. We need to oftentimes stop what we're doing and take care of our children because they're our primary, concern or responsibility. So it's really just sort of navigating that. And if for some reason you handled it in a way that you wish you didn't, just go back, whether it's hours or a day later, and just say, look, I was really caught off guard, I was embarrassed, whatever it might be, because we all experience so many different sort of feelings and emotions. And just go back and revisit it.
It seems like
it's not a big deal.
It would probably be a great approach to just be honest about how that it was uncomfortable for you. Just like something you mentioned in your workshop about if your child asks a question that's particularly awkward or you really don't know what to say about it, it is okay to say, I'm not sure how to answer that. Let me get back to you on it. But be sure to follow through with it so they don't feel like they asked something inappropriate or that, right?
Absolutely. And also I would just say that nonverbal messages are as powerful, if not more powerful at times, than verbal messages. Just to really be conscious of... You
mean like an expression you might make?
Or expression of disapproval or something like that. And what kind of message that is, because oftentimes when we think back about how we were growing up, even if we grew up in a house that was open about sexuality, oftentimes at least there was a message that you got, and more often than not, those aren't the experiences. Usually people come from a place of not having these conversations, and it was the nonverbal messages that they received that have really impacted them as adults, which is what they're trying to change with their kids.